Hi, my name is Mike Tidwell, Executive Director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. Um, I have struggled with the sadness and grief surrounding climate change for decades. I first read Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, in 1990, which was the first book for a mass audience that laid out the crisis of climate change. And even then, when I was 28 years old, I realized that this issue was going to dominate my life and that of all my loved ones, and that the prospects were not good, that we were going to stabilize the climate in time to avoid really serious impacts. Um, I will tell you that since I read his book at age 28, I don't think that I've experienced deep happiness since then. And by deep happiness, I mean the kind of assured happiness. You can have temporary happiness when you eat a meal. You can have temporary happiness when you watch a sports event or at a picnic with your family. But to have deep happiness requires the prospect of more happiness in the future, the assurance that times can be this happy years from now. And I think climate change takes that away from people who fully let in the reality of this crisis. The prospect of deep happiness in the future seems suspect at best, and therefore it minimizes how happy you can actually feel in your life at the current moment. So I've struggled with that. Yes, fleeting moments of happiness, but because of climate change in the back of my mind, I don't think I've been truly deeply happy since I was in my late 20s. Now, I will say that there are things you can do to counteract that sadness. For me, it's activism. It's a tonic. It's a medicine. When I can take action on climate change, when I can do something to promote clean energy, when I can fight polluters, then I feel better in my life and I'm more emotionally well off. In 2002, I formed the Chesapeake Climate Action Network to give myself more opportunities for activism. There weren't many groups in the Mid-Atlantic fighting climate change, fighting for clean energy solutions in Maryland, Virginia, and DC. So I formed the Chesapeake Climate Action Network for that reason. Um, in the early 2000s, when CCAM was born, the idea was we were going to switch to clean energy fast enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, to mitigate the most severe outcomes of climate change through clean energy. And that sort of kept us going. Instead of 20 feet of sea level rise wiping out cities, we'd have more manageable 2 feet of sea level rise. Instead of droughts that trigger civil wars, we would have droughts that would be a challenge to farmers, but they could handle it. Now, fast forward to 2025, and I feel like the worst impacts are happening. We are making great strides on clean energy. The clean energy revolution's unstoppable. We deploy a gigawatt of solar power around the world every day. That's like a major nuclear power plant worth of solar every day. Nobody can stop that. But we started too late. And as a result, climate impacts are really intensifying. On my own street, the 7100 block of Willow Avenue in Tacoma Park, Maryland, right on the border with Washington, D.C. I've lived there for 30 years. About the time I read Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, I moved onto this street in 1991, the 7100 block of Willow Avenue. And in past times, if you live in the same place for 30 years, you would see a lot of change for sure. You would see fashion change. You would see babies born. You would see people move away from that block. But in the era of climate change, you now also see the changing climate. And that has brought more grief and more sadness to me and other people in the climate movement because especially in the last 5 or 6 years on my block in Maryland, we've seen many, many of our biggest trees die. 100-year-old oaks, 150-year-old oaks. And it's not me saying it's climate change that's killing them. It's the city arborists, it's the public works department, it's the tree experts who come to cut the trees down, who say that climate change is killing our biggest trees. There's been an epidemic of it across the mid-Atlantic, just incredible dieback of large trees. And these are our trophies. You know, these are our spatial giants. These are the trees that provide the most habitat for migratory birds and for insects and for lichens and for, you know, squirrels and raccoons. And they're dying at a record rate. One arborist told me that when a tree dies in a national forest, it's a statistic, it's a number. But when it dies in your backyard, it's a friend. And so we have this new level of grief in my neighborhood from our dying trees, and realizing that we've crossed some kind of threshold because of extreme rain, interspersed with extreme droughts that our big trees can't survive. We've crossed a threshold on this planet where big elderly trees can no longer survive. And it's saddening. We see the remains of these trees, the tree stumps that are left behind that are like tombstones. And it's like living in a graveyard of old giants. And it's not just here, you know, the iconic stone pines of Rome are dying because of climate-induced beetle infestations. The bristlecone pines in Utah, southern Utah, uh, trees are 1,000 years old, are dying from thirst because of droughts. The giant cedars of Lebanon are catching on fire. And I think this has brought a new level of grief for me because I love trees. And I will say that, you know, there's a lot of clean energy in my neighborhood. At the same time that we've seen the passing of trees, we've seen the coming of clean energy, more and more solar, more and more electric vehicles. A neighbor of mine calls it the faint harmony of angels when you hear those electric cars going down the street. And I will say the action that's always been a tonic for me in fighting climate change is still there with trees. Because in my neighborhood, when a big tree dies, one of two things happen. And that flood of sunlight that suddenly appears in the neighborhood block, one of two things happen. Either people put up solar panels on that suddenly sunny nearby residential roof or that commercial roof, or number two, gardens happen. People start growing food or flowers in that suddenly sunny spot. And that helps manage the grief of the passing trees. So there's a lot more solar in my neighborhood. There's a lot more curbside gardening of vegetables and other plants. And I find myself hanging on to that as a tonic for the sadness. And planting new trees, which I've done in my neighborhood. On my block, I planted a swamp white oak, a tree that's more accustomed to floods and droughts. So we see a lot of tree planting in my neighborhood. But the question we have is, how long will these trees last? Will these trees that we're planting now that are 5 feet tall, will they live to be 100 years, 150 years old, like so many of the trees that have died? It's an open question. And planting a tree is an act of hope, period, because that tree is going to survive long after I'm gone. And you plant it with the hope that your children and grandchildren will be around to see it grow up. So I will say for me, in the climate grief and sadness that I struggle with and have for decades, and now that it's arguably deepening with even our trees dying in the neighborhood, it's planting those in the new trees and still fighting for a stable climate that keeps me going. And that's my climate grief story.